Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time when things were, somehow, both simpler and significantly more questionable. So if you're settling into bed, maybe dim the lights, adjust your pillow, and take a slow breath. We're going to wander through the medieval world in that soft, sleepy way. The way where every fact feels just slightly too absurd to be real. And yet history is politely insisting, no, really, this happened, and we're starting with something gentle, something quiet, something so utterly ordinary that it shaped the entire Middle Ages without ever trying to be dramatic. Bread. Yes, bread. The closest thing the medieval world had to an emotional support food. A loaf so central to life that people practically prayed it into existence, scolded it when it misbehaved, and blamed it for everything when things went wrong, which, given medieval weather, was often tonight. We're drifting into why medieval bread was basically a superfood, and why your modern supermarket loaf soft, suspiciously springy, and lasting 3 to 4 business weeks without aging would probably horrify the average 12th century peasant. So, let's settle in. Let's float gently into the grain fields of medieval Europe, where the air smelled like damp wheat, wood smoke, and the faint panic of someone who remembered too late that they left their dough rising for approximately 9 hours longer than intended. The medieval loaf, equal parts food and social lifeline to start. Medieval bread wasn't just bread. It was calories. It was survival. It was the medieval equivalent of a Wi-Fi connection, because when it went out, things collapsed rapidly, and usually with screaming. Most peasants ate bread at nearly every meal, not because they loved carbs, which they did, but because bread was the one thing that stood between them and the kind of hunger that makes you start eyeing turnips with a dangerous fondness. And it wasn't just a loaf. There were layers of bread, hierarchy, because of course there were. The medieval world loved hierarchy so much, it put it on food items. At the top was the fine white bread, known as manchet, eaten by nobles, who had the time and resources to sift flour over and over until all traces of nutrition had been politely removed. Below that came coarser brown breads, eaten by peasants who preferred their food with a little more texture, fiber, and occasional mystery ingredients. And then there was horse bread, dense brick made from beans, oats, barley, and whatever else we found in the bin. Humans technically could eat it, but generally only did so when things were going exceptionally badly, which they often were. The point is, medieval bread was everywhere, and oddly enough, it was surprisingly healthy. Not because medieval bakers knew what they were doing, but because they were forced to do things the old-fashioned way. The secret superfood formula, accidentally nutritious. So why was medieval bread a superfood? Well, first, stone-ground flour. When you grind grain with stone, little flecks of the millstone end up in the flour. This sounds alarming, and it sort of is, but those tiny mineral fragments added a natural boost of iron, calcium, and grit, quite literally grit, that strengthened medieval teeth and bones. Modern industrial milling removes almost everything except the pure, pale starch, leaving us with bread that tastes like someone whispered wheat over a bowl of warm foam. Second, medieval bread used whole grains, bran, germ, and all. The nutrients were right there. The fiber was right there. The flavor was right there, but subtle enough that people pretended it wasn't. Third, and this is the real star, long fermentation. Medieval bakers didn't have commercial yeast. They had sourdough starters, bubbling jars that sat quietly judging the household for centuries. Dough fermented slowly, often overnight, breaking down gluten and releasing beneficial acids. Your modern loaf, on the other hand, is the product of a yeast-strained bread, specifically to rise like an over-caffeinated sprinter, giving the dough roughly half a moment to think about its life choices before becoming bread. The medieval result: a loaf easier to digest, richer in micronutrients, and absolutely incapable of surviving more than 48 hours without turning into an emotional support brick. But that's what people expected. Bread wasn't meant to be immortal. Food wasn't tea meant to have a shelf life that outlasted 3 kings and a minor civil conflict. Bread as currency, status, and sometimes weapon. Bread was so important that entire relationships revolved around it. Landlords paid laborers in bread rations. Monasteries gave out bread as charity. Kings issued emergency bread laws whenever harvests failed, and people started eyeing the palace wall with the kind of determination that never ended well. In some towns, bakers could be fined or publicly shamed for selling underweight loaves, the size of bread and ale. A famous English regulation basically told bakers, "You will bake bread correctly, you will not scam people, and if you do, we will embarrass you." And they did. They tied cheating bakers by the waist and dunked them repeatedly into rivers because nothing says justice like being aggressively rinsed in front of your neighbors. It was a gentle reminder that in medieval society, bread wasn't just food. It was trust. It was community. It was the one stable thing in a world where roofs leaked, governments wobbled, and everyone was vaguely sick at all times. Modern bread. Why the medieval peasant would politely decline if you handed a medieval villager a slice of modern supermarket bread. Soft, pale, smelling faintly of sadness, they would probably poke it suspiciously and ask whether it was supposed to be medicine. To them, modern bread would feel like eating a warm, damp pillow. Modern bread is puffed up with air, stabilized with emulsifiers, preserved with ingredients that look like they belong in an alchemist's notebook, and engineered to be as emotionally neutral as possible. Medieval bread was dense, heavy, and caloric because people needed energy. They spent their days doing labor modern gyms would classify as unsafe. A loaf today is designed for convenience. A loaf then was designed to keep you alive long enough to complain about the weather. And we haven't even mentioned the gluten problem. Today, some people struggle with gluten intolerance, some because of biology, some because wheat has been hybridized and refined into something medieval farmers wouldn't recognize even on its best day. Long fermentation helped break down gluten. Modern quick-rise methods do not. So yes, medieval bread was basically an accidental superfood, not because people were enlightened geniuses, but because the technology to ruin bread efficiently hadn't been invented yet. Bread and the medieval personality. Bread shaped the medieval temperament. You can't eat several pounds of dense, fibrous bread a day, every day, and remain emotionally unpredictable. Your energy remains flat. Your expectations stay reasonable. You develop a resigned acceptance of life's many uninvited inconveniences. For nobles, bread was also symbolic. Fine white manchet bread, carefully sifted through absurdly fine cloth, was the edible equivalent of saying, "Yes, hello, I'm wealthy enough to remove nutrition from my food for aesthetic reasons," and they did it proudly. Peasants, meanwhile, ate dark earthy loaves made from rye, spelt barley, oats, and whatever else grew without immediately giving up. Nobles mocked peasant bread. Peasants mocked nobles for paying more to eat less. Everyone felt superior. It was perfect medieval balance. When bread went wrong, the great rye fiascos, of course, not all medieval bread was superfood gold. Sometimes it was cursed. Enter ergot, a lovely little fungus that grows on rye and occasionally causes hallucinations, convulsions, and the sensation of insects crawling under your skin. Yes, that. When ergot got into bread, the entire villagers had what we would now call a very bad weekend. People twitched, screamed, wandered naked, saw demons, and occasionally thought their limbs were turning into snakes. Medieval chroniclers calmly wrote all this down, probably while eating their own rye loaf and attempting to look judgmental enough to avoid suspicion. Some historians believe ergot outbreaks caused dancing plagues, witchcraft accusations, and a significant portion of medieval neighbors deciding that someone nearby was definitely in league with a goat-shaped demon. So yes, medieval bread was a superfood, unless it wasn't, and then it was a psychedelic mistake. Bread as tableware, because plates were optional. One charming detail about medieval meals is that people often didn't bother with plates. They used trencherous large slabs of stale bread that served as a personal edible plate. You put your food on the trencher, it soaked up the juices, and when you were done, you either ate the trencher or gave it to someone poorer than you. This meant the social hierarchy extended all the way down to plate eating. Nobles ate food off bread. Servants ate the bread that nobles had used as plates. Dogs occasionally hovered nearby for whatever remained. So next time someone complains about washing dishes, feel free to remind them that medieval people outsourced the job to their lunch. Why medieval bread tasted different. Let's drift for a moment into the medieval kitchen. Hot, smoky, probably loud, and featuring bread that looks absolutely nothing like the neat, symmetrical loaves you see in grocery aisles. Their flour was coarse, their ovens were unpredictable, their fermentation was slow, their salt levels varied depending on how lazy or enthusiastic the baker felt that day. And yet the flavor, rich, complex, slightly sour, deeply satisfying, because medieval bread wasn't pretending to be healthy, it just was. The earthiness came from whole grains, the tang came from natural fermentation, the nuttiness came from bran, and the faint crunch came from stone fragments, which, while not ideal, at least kept things interesting. Modern bread tastes like air, legally required to maintain a loaf shape. Medieval bread tasted like someone put effort into it, even if the effort was mostly accidental. The emotional relationship between people and bread in medieval Europe. Bread was tied to everything: blessings, oaths, hospitality, charity, power, identity. People took their bread seriously. Arguments broke out over who had the right to bake, sell, tax, or even carry bread in public. If a noble household failed to provide good bread to guests, it was considered a social failure, on par with forgetting to clean the guest room. In some circles, forgetting to have a guest room at all. Bread showed up in marriage negotiations, land agreements, feudal contracts, peace treaties, and sermons that began, "Our Lord is like a loaf," because medieval priests needed metaphors people could actually understand. Modern people see bread as optional. Medieval people saw bread as destiny. And to be fair, if your average daily workload involved hauling hay, dodging livestock with suspicious attitudes, and hoping your roof didn't fall on you again this winter, a stable source of carbs was probably the closest thing you had to a comforting life philosophy. Let's drift to the next curiosity. So that's medieval bread: nutritious by accident, essential by necessity, sometimes hallucinogenic, occasionally weaponized, and absolutely fundamental to the medieval world in ways modern people can barely imagine. And as we gently drift forward, we'll slide into the next quiet corner of medieval life. Another strange custom, another royal oddity, another quietly ridiculous thing people did because the universe said, sure, why not? Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, which would be impressive, go ahead and settle deeper into your pillow. Let your breathing soften a little. Let your mind drift back into the medieval world, where dynasties were carefully constructed, meticulously documented, and genetically, let's say, optimistic. Tonight, we're wandering into the realm of fragile royal bloodlines, those delicate, shimmering family trees that looked stable from a distance, but, upon closer inspection, resembled something drawn by a toddler with a spiral obsession. This is the world of kings and queens who married their cousins, produced children shaped by centuries of questionable genetics, and then proudly called it divine right. Because of course they did. So let's drift, gently, into the softly lit corridors of European castles, where torches flickered, tapestries sagged, and royal families made choices. The idea of royal purity, or let's marry our relatives again. Royal families had one rule about marriage: keep it in the family. Not because they thought genetics were fun to gamble with, but because land, power, and titles were fragile things. If a princess married the wrong person, an entire kingdom could end up in the hands of someone who wasn't even related to your second favorite cousin. And so, to keep power pure, they kept marrying each other, and marrying each other, and yes, marrying each other. If DNA could talk, it would have quietly packed its bags and left the palace. To medieval royalty, cousin marriage seemed perfectly normal. This was before genetics, before Punnett squares, and long before the moment someone finally asked, "Hey, why do all our kids look vaguely startled and faint at unexpected moments?" But the truth is simple. Medieval royals had very fragile bloodlines, and those bloodlines shaped entire kingdoms. Let's drift to the Habsburgs, the final boss of inbreeding. You can't talk about fragile dynasties without visiting the Habsburgs, Europe's favorite case study in maybe too much family time. Even medieval chroniclers noticed something was evolving, or rather, unevolving. The Habsburgs were committed, thoroughly committed, to keeping titles inside the family, and the result was a gene pool so shallow you could wade across it without getting your ankles wet. By the time we reach Charles II of Spain, the dynasty's crown jewel of genetic consequences, things have gotten delicate. Charles II was known politely as the Bewitched, not because he did magic, but because people assumed something supernatural had to explain all of that. He had difficulty chewing, difficulty speaking, difficulty walking, difficulty ruling, and difficulty surviving all the health issues created by being the product of relatives who were already the products of relatives. He inherited a jaw so famously protruding that it later became a symbol of the entire dynasty's genetic perseverance. And yet here's the gentle part: Charles tried. He really tried. He ruled as best he could. He wanted to be strong. He wanted to be effective. But his body simply wasn't built for the job. Thanks to about 16 generations of family decisions that could be described as ambitious but structurally unsound. Let's gently drift away before the Habsburg jaw becomes too sharp of an image for bedtime. The Plantagenet's hair, tempers, and questionable stability. Now, let's wander into England. The Plantagenets were not known for inbreeding on the scale of the Habsburgs, but they were known for another hereditary trait, a genetically gifted level of rage. They had tempers that could have powered small villages if properly harnessed. Some historians say this came from their fiery red hair. Others say it came from centuries of political stress. Personally, I think it came from living in cold, drafty castles where your siblings constantly plotted against you. Take Henry II, who married Eleanor of Aquitaine. Together, they produced children who hated each other so deeply and so consistently that it became their main family bonding activity. Their sons rebelled against Henry repeatedly. Sometimes they rebelled together. Sometimes they rebelled separately. Sometimes they rebelled because it was Thursday. The Plantagenets weren't fragile in body. Most of them were physically sturdy, loud, and fully capable of swinging swords through furniture. But their emotional stability, delicate, translucent, on par with modern cell phone screens. This dynasty's weakness wasn't genetics, it was temperament. They were allergic to peace, and peace, in medieval Europe, was already rare enough, without one family deciding to ruin it recreationally. The Valois, a dynasty held together by thin thread and thinner patience, now drift with me into France. The Valois dynasty was, for a time, the very picture of medieval power: elegant, wealthy, fashionable, and catastrophically unlucky. They suffered from a mix of fragile health, fragile politics, and fragile decision-making. It was a triple threat of instability. The star example is Charles VI, known as Charles the Mad because medieval naming conventions were brutally honest. Charles VI began his reign young, hopeful, and impressively sane. Then one day, during a military campaign, he suddenly attacked his own men, killed several, and ran screaming into the forest. After that, episodes of delusion came and went, like uninvited houseguests. Sometimes he forgot his own name. Sometimes he thought he was made of glass, completely literal glass, and refused to let people touch him. He reportedly sat still for hours so he wouldn't shatter, which, to be fair, is a very calm activity, just not ideal for a king. His illness wasn't caused by inbreeding alone, though the Valois did dabble. It was a mix of genetic predisposition and medieval mental health treatment, which mostly consisted of prayers, herbal teas, and telling the patient to stop being difficult. The result: a fragile dynasty, a fragile king, a kingdom drifting slowly toward disaster. The Ptolemies, Egypt's most dramatic family tree. Now let's float several centuries earlier, down the Nile. The Ptolemies were, without exaggeration, the Olympic champions of marrying their siblings. They took Greek royal tradition, dialed it up to 11, then decided that 11 wasn't high enough. Their goal was to keep divine blood pure, which resulted in generations of rulers who shared so many chromosomes that their family tree resembled a circle. By the time we reached Cleopatra VII, the famous one, the dynasty is genetically fragile, politically fragile, and emotionally well exhausted. Cleopatra herself was intelligent, charismatic, linguistically gifted, and quite healthy, suggesting that sometimes genetics simply shrugged and said, "Fine, I'll allow it." But many of her relatives were not so lucky. Some had health issues, some had cognitive challenges, some simply didn't live long enough to be studied in detail. Sibling marriage does that. It creates what scholars politely call genetic bottlenecks, and what non-scholars call, maybe we should stop doing this. But the Ptolemies didn't stop. They kept going until the dynasty collapsed under the weight of Roman ambition and its own genetic exhaustion. The Trastomeres, when fragile health shapes a nation, now drift back to Spain. But away from the Habsburgs, into the house of Trastamara, their family tree is filled with kings and queens whose health was delicate enough to be considered a national security concern. Take Henry IV of Castile, politely nicknamed Henry the Impotent. Historians still debate whether he truly had reproductive issues or simply had a complicated marriage, but medieval gossip insisted on the least charitable interpretation. The result was a kingdom panicking over succession, questioning paternity, and occasionally threatening war because the royal bedroom wasn't producing enough heirs. Nothing says stable monarchy like arguing over your king's medical chart. His cousin, Isabella I, later of Ferdinand and Isabella fame, was healthier, but many relatives weren't. The dynasty had a knack for producing rulers who got sick easily, died young, or struggled in ways that made governance complicated. The fragility wasn't always genetic. Sometimes it was the stress of ruling a country with too many dukes, too many factions, and too many nobles who believed they were being personally victimized by taxes. Still, the Trastomeres became another example of how vulnerable royal bloodlines could be. Why were medieval royals so fragile? Let's rest here for a moment. Take a quiet breath. The truth is, medieval royal families were fragile for three simple reasons. 1. They married too narrowly. The noble dating pool was essentially a puddle. Everyone was related if you looked closely enough. 2. They lived stressful lives. Power is exhausting. Court politics were basically high-stakes gossip. 3. Medical care was medieval. If something went wrong, you were getting herbs, prayers, or possibly leeches. Two of those things don't work. Royal bodies were symbols of national identity, but those same bodies were often weak, ill, or overwhelmed, shaped by generations of insular marriages and constant political anxiety. It's strangely gentle. In a way, these were people expected to be powerful, divine, and perfect, while dealing with health conditions they didn't understand, genetics they couldn't escape, and expectations no human could realistically meet. Drifting toward the next part. As you let your eyes soften and your mind drift, imagine those dim corridors of royal palaces. Imagine portraits of kings who look suspiciously like their uncles. Imagine dynasties built on fragile foundations, trying quietly, persistently to maintain the illusion of strength. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. You're now officially doing better than half the medieval princelings we're about to discuss. So go ahead and settle again. Nestle in, maybe adjust your blanket, the way medieval royalty adjusted their sense of entitlement, frequently, dramatically, and for no reason. Tonight, we're drifting into the soft, candlelit nursery rooms of medieval palaces, the places where future kings and queens spent their earliest years being adored, overprotected, misunderstood, and occasionally dropped into political crises before they could walk without wobbling. Royal childhoods were rarely normal, rarely healthy, and almost never peaceful. They were shaped by dynastic pressure, questionable medical advice, and the constant presence of 4 to 12 nurses who all disagreed about how warm a baby should be. So let's float gently into these royal cradles, some carved in gold, others smelling faintly of goat fat, and see what made medieval childhoods so fragile. so strange, and sometimes so unintentionally funny. The royal baby as a political object. From the moment a royal child inhaled their first uncertain breath, they weren't a person. Not really. They were an heir, a symbol, a bargaining chip, wrapped in very expensive blankets. Courtiers examined babies the way modern people compare smartphones. Oh, this one is sturdy. This one seems a bit small. This one cries too much, possibly a bad omen. This one has a faint rashes. Start drafting a treaty, just in case. Every royal infant came with expectations that could have crushed an adult dragon, let alone someone who couldn't hold up their own head yet. And the pressure wasn't just emotional. Medieval physicians had a talent for making everything worse. If the baby seemed cold, gives more blankets. If the baby seemed hot, gives more blankets. If the baby coughed, gives prayers. If the baby sneezed, gives the kingdom considered exile. It's really a miracle any royal child survived long enough to become a disappointing adult. Let's drift to England and visit young Edward VI. Edward VI, son of the famously subtle Henry VIII, was a perfect example of a royal childhood held together by ceremony, tutors, and mild panic. Edward was small, pale, and frail from birth. People described him with words like delicate, refined, and please don't let him climb stairs. His nurses monitored every breath. Every cough triggered a discussion about cosmic omens. Every lost appetite sparked rumors that he had inherited too much of his father's personality, which was a terrifying thought. Edward spent most of his childhood learning Latin, memorizing prayers, and being told repeatedly that he was destined to rule England. Just as long as he did, not fall over, catch a chill, or sneeze too aggressively. He was tutored by the best scholars in Europe, but nobody could tutor his immune system. By the age of 15, after just 6 years on the throne, Edward's health collapsed like a medieval chair under a very large baron. His death ended his brief reign and plunged England into yet another dynastic struggle. All because medieval royal childhoods weren't built for longevity. Young Charles VI, a warning from France. Remember Charles VI, the king who eventually believed he was made of glass? Well, his childhood gave us a few early hints. Charles was described as gentle, pretty, and sensitive, basically a medieval prince Disney would have been proud of. Except he was so fragile that a stern breeze could have knocked him sideways. He endured frequent fevers, bouts of exhaustion, and long stretches where he simply stared into space as if he were contemplating the meaning of life, or counting the number of tapestries in the room. His court treated him with the terrified caution of people who suspected destiny had made a mistake, but didn't want to say anything out loud. As he grew, Charles showed brilliant sharp memory, eloquence, a kind nature, but his mental health deteriorated early, most likely triggered by stress, genetics, and the medieval inability to provide literally any useful treatment. His delicate childhood became a delicate adulthood, and eventually a very delicate kingdom. The young Habsburgs, a nursery full of jaws in Habsburg nurseries. Children were born already carrying genetic baggage, and everyone knew it. Some were healthy at first, glance bright eyes, healthy color until someone said, "He has the jaw," and the room fell silent. Nurses whispered, courtiers sighed, doctors stroked their beards. Everyone quietly prepared themselves for a life of chewing challenges. But it wasn't just jaws. The Habsburg infants often had delicate digestion, frequent fevers, vision problems, weak immune systems, and in many cases, developmental delays. Medieval doctors, of course, prescribed their usual treatments: herbal broths, holy water, very intense prayers, and sometimes powdered gemstones. Nothing says effective medicine like feeding a baby finely crushed sapphire. Young Charles II of Spain, the dynasty's most fragile masterpiece, spent most of his childhood being coaxed to eat, sleep, breathe steadily, and please, just please, remain alive long enough to be king. His survival into adulthood wasn't seen as a blessing. It was considered a plot twist. Royal education, a curriculum of stress despite frailty. Royal children were expected to become perfect rulers. Their tutors created schedules that would overwhelm a full-grown adult with 2 cups of coffee and a solid night's sleep. A typical day for a royal child included morning prayers, Latin lessons, French lessons, genealogy lessons because you must memorize all your cousins before marrying one sword, practice etiquette drills, political briefings, more prayers, a lecture on why peasants must be respected but not spoken to, and dinner, consisting mainly of boiled meat and the weight of expectations. Young kings had to appear wise before they understood half their vocabulary. Young queens had to appear graceful before their legs were fully coordinated. A mistake wasn't just embarrassing, it was political. Drop your spoon gives the nobles whisper. Trip on a stair gives foreign ambassadors take notes. Fall asleep in a lesson gives the kingdom wonders if you're developing Habsburg level weakness. No pressure at all. The peculiar case of young Richard II. Richard II of England had a childhood that was almost stereotypically royal, pampered, admired, praised for his beauty, and sheltered from anything resembling reality. Everyone told him he was special. Everyone told him he was destined for greatness. Everyone forgot to tell him that kings sometimes need to compromise, negotiate, or avoid making everyone hate them. Richard grew up believing he was a living symbol of divine kingship, which is adorable in a child and dangerous in a ruler. He wasn't sickly, but he was fragile in a different way psychologically. He couldn't handle criticism. He couldn't handle rebellion. He could barely handle the weather. His childhood molded him into a king who expected the world to cooperate with him simply because that's what he'd been told as a boy. The medieval world did not cooperate. Royal toys, games, and early influences. You might imagine royal children playing with gilded toys and miniature castles. And sometimes they did. But the truth, most royal toys were designed to prepare children for their future roles. Little princes received wooden swords, toy horses, miniature suits of armor, tiny shields, and occasionally a real pony, which they were absolutely not ready for. Little princesses received embroidery kits, doll-like figures dressed in elaborate court fashion, miniature spinning wheels, and a lifetime supply of subtle pressure. Some royal children were given pets, falcons, hunting dogs, or the occasional exotic animal gifted by another kingdom. Imagine being 5 and receiving a leopard you were absolutely not expected to feed or approach. These early influences shaped medieval rulers in strange ways. If you give a child a sword at 3, don't be surprised if they prefer war to diplomacy later. If you praise a princess only for grace and modesty, don't expect her to embrace the chaos of ruling a kingdom. Medieval childhoods weren't designed for emotional balance. They were designed for political utility. Illness, the constant shadow, fragile health, was a given. Royal children lived better than most peasants, but they were not healthier. Overfeeding, underexercising, overage doctors, and genetic issues all contributed to a long list of common afflictions. Some illnesses came from inbreeding. Some came from poor sanitation. Some came from the fact that medieval medicine had roughly the same accuracy as asking a goat for medical advice. A single fever could destroy an entire succession plan, and it often did. Court records frequently say things like, "The prince was taken with a small cough." Everyone panicked. The princess had a chill. People started drafting treaties. The young lord could not rise from bed. Half the court packed their belongings. Royal nurseries were full of herbs, charms, whispered prayers, and absolute dread. The soft sadness of short childhoods, the fragility of royal childhoods, meant many rulers began leading nations before they had fully grown. Some became kings at 10, some at 8, a few at 2, and 1 or 2 technically before birth, because medieval kingship loved drama. These children were immediately placed under regents, usually ambitious relatives who spent the king's childhood fighting for control of him like a very expensive, politically motivated babysitting competition. A child king meant instability. Instability meant plots. Plots meant stress. Stress meant illness. And illness meant another succession crisis. It was a loop no medieval kingdom ever solved. A gentle drift toward the next part. So as you relax deeper into your blanket, imagine the soft echo of a medieval nursery, gently rocking cradles, whispered prayers, and the slightly panicked footsteps of nurses trying to figure out whether the baby is sweating from warmth or anxiety. Royal childhoods were delicate things shaped by high expectations, fragile health, and futures none of them had asked for. Hey, everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, which is statistically unlikely at this point, go ahead and adjust your blanket. Maybe shift your pillow and let your eyelids grow a little heavier. Tonight, we're drifting softly into another corner of medieval life, where high society managed to survive on a diet so questionable that even the rats probably judged them. And yes, we're going to talk about vegetables, the glamorous stuff. Let's drift in. Most people today imagine medieval noble feasts as heavy tables piled with roasted boar, overflowing goblets, and maybe a lute player who didn't really want to be there. But one of the quieter truths is that medieval elites were absolutely terrified, genuinely frightened of vegetables. They considered them suspicious, too earthy, too common, too healthy. Ironically, leafy greens, peasant food, legumes, dangerous for the humors. Fennel, best left to goats. The average nobleman in 1300 Europe basically looked at a cabbage the way you might look at an unmarked package on your doorstep. Perhaps innocent, but probably cursed. Which brings us, in the gentlest and sleepiest way, to one of the strangest aristocratic obsessions of the era, the fear of nightshades. Today, you might slice a tomato onto a sandwich without a second thought. Back then, doing that would have been considered only slightly less reckless than licking a medieval doorknob. Tomatoes were new, foreign, and suspiciously shiny, like something conjured by an overly dramatic apothecary. Eggplants looked like they were plotting something. Bell peppers, far too cheerful for the medieval emotional climate. And potatoes didn't even make their European debut until the age of exploration. But once they did, elites decided they were ungodly. The potato grows underground, which apparently made it the vegetable equivalent of a demon internship. So nobles avoided nightshades like the plague. Meanwhile, peasants ate them gratefully, and, somewhat awkwardly, tended to live longer. Let's drift gently now to a real, documented case of aristocratic vegetable panic. The poor King Charles VIII of France, who ruled in the late 1400s. To be clear, Charles VIII had many problems. He was underschooled, overconfident, and according to contemporary accounts, built like a candlestick, which, in medieval chronicler language, meant he was shaped like a single straight line. Naturally, he was also afraid of tomatoes. Not personally, he probably never even saw one, but his court physicians wrote extensively about the dangerous acidity of New World fruits, which they believed could corrupt the royal humors. They recommended that His Majesty stick to boiled meats, stale bread, and the occasional pear if properly roasted until unrecognizable. It's not surprising then that Charles VIII died at 27 after walking into a doorframe. When you never eat vegetables, bone density tends to file divorce papers. But the vegetable anxiety didn't stop there. Across the Channel, medieval England was thriving in its own very special way. And by thriving, I mean dramatically misunderstanding most things related to nutrition. Let's drift softly toward King Henry VI, a ruler so gentle and frail that chroniclers compared him favorably to a dandelion. He fainted frequently, avoided conflict with the dedication of a medieval pacifist monk, and ate almost exclusively soft white bread because chewing was stressful. His physicians warned him that vegetables could dilute the royal spirit, which is one of history's earliest examples of a medical professional making something up on the spot. So Henry avoided anything green with the devotion of a modern toddler. People around him, however, noticed he was constantly tired, chronically ill, and anxious. Classic effects of eating nothing but carbohydrates and fear. Now, we can't float through medieval vegetable history without drifting towards Spain, where eating choices reached new artistic heights of poor judgment. One of the more interesting casualties of nutritional misinformation was Prince Don Carlos, son of King Philip II. Don Carlos was famously unhealthy, famously volatile, and famously shaped like someone had drawn a person from memory after being told only the word aristocrat. He had brittle bones, chronic stomach issues, and a personality best described as medieval explosive. His diet, almost entirely bread, meat, and wine, No greens, no fruit, except dried figs, which he insisted be soaked in wine for purification, a phrase that did a lot of heavy lifting in the 1500s. No vegetables whatsoever, his physicians warned. They would disturb his royal melancholy, and yes, they disturbed it anyway. At one point, Don Carlos attempted to starve himself to death, then switched strategies and tried to eat too much at once, then tried a sort of medieval diet cleanse that consisted entirely of boiling water. Spoiler, none of these helped. Eventually, Philip II imprisoned his own son for being too chaotic, which is a sentence that sounds harsh until you read literally anything Don Carlos ever did. But part of his long list of problems was the simple fact that he ate like a medieval raccoon. Gently now, let's drift north again, toward the chilly courts of Scandinavia, where kings were tall, pale, and utterly perplexed by the concept of vitamins. King Magnus IV of Sweden, for instance, lived in a court obsessed with omen reading and humoral balance. His advisors believed vegetables were cold and sad foods, suitable only for monks and servants. So the king ate mostly salted fish, preserved meats, and rye bread dense enough to stun a cow. It kept him alive, technically, but the lack of micronutrients left him exhausted, gloomy, and unusually susceptible to falling off horses. One chronicler remarks that Magnus suffered from great fogs of the mind, a medieval way of saying he was tired, confused, and vitamin deficient to the point of philosophical meltdown. But at least he didn't eat cabbage. That would have been reckless. Now, drifting slowly into the dim glow of candlelight, let's visit medieval Italian courts, specifically Florence and the Medici family, who were brilliant in finance and catastrophically wrong about health. The Medici physicians warned against earth foods, claiming they caused heaviness of mood and moral decline. Yes, vegetables were apparently responsible for moral decline, so wealthy Florentines avoided fresh produce while peasants grew old on beans, onions, and garden greens. This created an interesting health phenomenon. Peasants were sturdier, stronger, and less prone to fainting spells than the people who ruled them. Imagine being a medieval noble and passing out at a chess game because you refused to eat a carrot. The irony is that medieval medicine actually understood some things correctly. They knew sour milk was sketchy. They knew wounds needed cleaning. They knew not to drink from puddles unless you genuinely hated yourself. But vegetables, they drew the line at vegetables. This was partly due to humoral theory, partly due to superstition, and partly due to aristocratic self-image. Eating vegetables signaled that you were poor, practical, and sober-minded, three qualities medieval elites worked very hard to avoid. So instead, they doubled down on bread, meat, and wine. They endured gout, anemia, fatigue, and digestion experiences best not described. They believed it was just the natural burden of high birth. Meanwhile, peasants ate legumes that kept them alive, onions that boosted their immune systems, and cabbage that provided crucial vitamins. They didn't know why these foods helped, they just knew they could walk up a hill without hesitation. Unlike the nobles who needed 3 stops and a prayer. Let's drift now to the soft edges of this idea, because bread, of course, was the medieval superfood, especially for peasants. It was full of grains, fiber, minerals, and occasionally small rocks. But it was still infinitely better than the aristocratic eating habits that were slowly dissolving royal health across the continent. Modern bread, lighter, whiter, chemically smoother, doesn't compare to the dense, nutrient-rich loaves people relied on for survival. But medieval elites, well, they ate the refined version, the fluffy white stuff, the kind stripped of nutrients, the kind that looks fancy and tastes bland and slowly depletes your body like a polite thief. So when you look at medieval portraits and wonder why so many nobles look vaguely wilted, like decorative plants left too long in the sunwell, their diet was doing most of the heavy lifting. And now, before your eyes get too heavy, let's gently drift toward the next part, where we'll explore why so many royals were sickly, sad, and strangely fragile, as if someone designed them using only for available DNA settings. Hey everyone, welcome back. If your eyes are getting heavy, that's perfect. This part is meant to float by like a tired cloud passing over a medieval field. Just settle in, take a slow breath, and let us drift deeper into the strange fragility of royals whose bodies seemed permanently set to low battery. Tonight, we're sinking gently into the soft, slightly tragic world of medieval noble physiology. Those pale, trembling figures who ruled entire kingdoms while being defeated by pollen, drafts, and stares. Because medieval peasants, they were out there wrestling livestock, plowing frozen fields, and raising 6 children who could probably lift a goat with one hand. Meanwhile, their kings were fainting because someone opened a window too quickly. Let's wander in softly. We'll start with a familiar figure, King Henry VI of England, whom we drifted past earlier. Henry is worth lingering on because he represents something like the default template for fragile medieval monarchy. He was gentle, devout, chronically fatigued, and possessed the general constitution of a physically overwhelmed librarian. His physicians lived in a state of constant alarm. They blamed everything on imbalanced humors, but modern historians note the obvious. He ate practically no vegetables, avoided sunlight, and had the sleep habits of a stressed owl. At one point, Henry experienced a mental collapse so severe that he forgot how to respond to human interaction for more than a year. His counselors tried everything: prayers, chants, soothing music, probably waving bread under his nose like a medieval therapy dog. It wasn't until he randomly snapped back that anyone breathed normally again, which is ironic, because breathing normally was one of his ongoing medical challenges. Let's drift lightly into France now, where fragility was almost a royal tradition. King Charles VI, also known as Charles the Mad, took fragile monarch physiology to astonishing heights. He was thin, pale, easily startled, and often convinced he was made of glass. Yes, actual glass. He refused physical contact, avoided movement, and wore reinforced clothing to protect himself from shattering. Imagine ruling France while fearing that sitting down to fast might cause you to explode. Glass delusion wasn't common, but it did pop up among elites, likely because of nutritional deficiencies, stress, and the general medieval experience of being alive. Meanwhile, peasants were out there breaking bones, resetting them, and going straight back to work while Charles was panicking about chairs. Now let's drift to one of Europe's most famously delicate dynasties, the Habsburgs, who achieved international fame by marrying each other so consistently that their DNA started sending polite resignation letters. Their most fragile victory was Charles II of Spain, a man whose existence was essentially a medical footnote in human form. Charles too was unable to walk unsupervised until age 8, unable to speak clearly until age 4, chronically ill, profoundly delayed, and somehow the king of a vast empire, which feels like a scheduling mistake. Chroniclers described him as the bewitched, which was the medieval way of saying, we don't understand genetics and don't want to. His Joff Mass for its Habsburg protrusion made chewing an Olympic event. He lived mostly on soft foods, wine, and superstition. His court tried everything: exorcisms, herbal baths, dietary restrictions that would make modern nutritionists cry. But nothing helped, because the real problem was that his family tree resembled a circle. Peasants at the time, meanwhile, were robust enough to carry sacks of grain heavier than Charles himself. Still drifting, we float northward again toward Scandinavia, home of tall warriors and surprisingly delicate nobles. King Eric of Pomerania, ruler of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, was raised in near luxury and fed a noble diet of meats, fine breads, and very few actual nutrients. By adulthood, he suffered from chronic fatigue, mood swings, and a mysterious inability to stay upright on horseback for more than an hour. His physicians blamed the wind, which, to be fair, was the closest thing medieval medicine had to a plausible explanation. But Eric's fragility wasn't unusual. Noble children were famously sickly. They spent their days indoors, surrounded by incense, stale air, and tutors who believed exercise caused moral decay. Peasant children, meanwhile, were outside wrestling goats and climbing trees like unpaid acrobats. Let's float a little further east now, into the courts of Hungary and Bohemia, where the luxuries of elite life included silk pillows, imported sugar, and the immune resilience of wet paper. One tragic example was Ladislas, the posthumous, who became king as a literal baby and spent his short life being overmedicated, oversheltered, and overbathed in suspicious herbal concoctions. His tutors avoided outdoor activities. His nurses restricted his diet to pure foods, which meant soft bread and bland broths. His physicians insisted on frequent bloodletting, because nothing says healthy childhood like draining the child. By his teens, Ladislas was fragile, weak, and prone to fainting. He died suddenly at 17, likely from leukemia, but his contemporaries blamed bad air and moral imbalance. Peasants at that age were already married, farming, and throwing hay bales with unsettling enthusiasm. And now, drifting gently like a tired leaf, we arrive at a quietly tragic truth. Medieval nobles had the worst combination of lifestyle factors possible. Poor diet, zero exercise in breeding, stressful politics, overzealous medical treatments, indoor living in drafty, smoky rooms, constant incense, inhalation, belief that sunlight was morally dangerous. You could design a worse health plan, but you'd really have to try. Peasants didn't choose their lifestyle either, but their survival depended on actual nutrition and movement. They worked outside, ate garden food, and developed bone density that would shame a modern weightlifter. Nobles were decorative, peasants were functional. That's the whole summary of medieval physiology. Drifting now to Italy again, where noble fragility took on almost theatrical qualities. The wealthy girls of Renaissance Florence were kept indoors, powdered, perfumed, and protected from drafts, with the defensive paranoia of people guarding a rare manuscript. Many grew up with weak lungs, low stamina, vitamin deficiencies, fainting tendencies, and the tragic inability to walk more than a short distance in heavy gowns. Their parents called this noble delicacy. Physicians called it temperamental melancholy. Historians today call it what happens when you raise someone like a porcelain decoration. Meanwhile, Italian peasant women were climbing hillsides with baskets full of olives, and sometimes an entire toddler. Then we float over to the Holy Roman Empire, where nobles developed an impressive range of mysterious illnesses that modern medicine would diagnose as malnutrition plus vibes. One Emperor Maximilian I complained constantly of exhaustion, breathlessness, and unexplained aches. His physicians blamed everything except his diet, which consisted mostly of refined bread, wine, and the occasional noble-approved pear. He believed vegetables were morally corrupting. He once refused roasted carrots on the grounds that they disturbed the royal humors, which is exactly the kind of sentence you get when your medical staff consists of anxious astrologers. But he lived longer than most nobles, mostly because he liked long walks and fresh air, which were basically superfoods in the 1500s. Let's drift into one more example before your eyelids close completely. Prince Arthur, eldest son of Henry VII, was raised almost entirely indoors. His tutors believed draughts caused illness. His physicians believed exercise caused deformity. His nurses believed fresh vegetables caused melancholy. By the time Arthur reached his teens, he was tall, intelligent, and as fragile as a piece of lace. He married Catherine of Aragon at 15, but died a few months later. Chronic illness, poor immunity, and decades of oversheltering did him in. His younger brother Henry, who became Henry VIII, was healthier, only because he ignored medical advice and actually exercised, at least until he stopped exercising and decided food was a personality trait. And so, as we drift toward the end of this part, we arrive gently at a simple truth. Peasants survived medieval life. Royals survived medieval prestige. It wasn't the same thing. The noble body was a delicate thing, built from inherited weaknesses, sedentary habits, bad medical advice, and a deep cultural fear of vegetables. And so many of them broke physically, mentally, or politically under pressures their own diets helped create. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still hanging on, still breathing slow and heavy, still maybe to sleep perfect, part 6 is where things get even softer, even slower, and, Ironically, even snullier. Tonight we're drifting gently into medieval hygiene. Yes, hygiene, the mysterious, inconsistent art form that shaped royal courts just as much as heredity or war. Don't worry, nothing graphic, just quiet, sleepy history about people who bathed maybe once a month and still wore crowns with absolute confidence. Let's float in. We'll start with something soothingly ironic. Medieval nobles thought bathing was dangerous. Not spiritually dangerous, not politically dangerous, just medically dangerous. Their physicians warned them that warm water opened the pores and allowed disease to float inside, like your skin was a castle gate and bacteria were just waiting for an invitation. So rulers who commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and built empires were also terrified of hot baths, because, naturally, they made it worse. This led to an entire class of elites who washed only their hands and faces, dabbed themselves with scented cloths, and hoped for the best. Meanwhile, peasants bathed in rivers because they didn't have time for hypothetical water-based demons. Let's drift into France for a moment. King Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, famously owned hundreds of outfits, dozens of wigs, and exactly 0 regular bathing routines. His doctors insisted he avoid water, so he relied on dry perfume, scented cloths, and the general belief that if you smelled expensive enough, people wouldn't notice anything else. One ambassador wrote that the king smelled strongly of roses, which is diplomat speak for "please stop inviting me to court on warm days." To be fair, Louis XIV wasn't alone. Most members of his court visited the perfumakers of Paris more often than they visited the bathhouse. Powders, oils, and lavender sachets were the medieval version of deodorant. They didn't fix the problem, but they made everyone feel better about ignoring it. Let's float backwards now, softly, into the Middle Ages. Queen Isabella of Castile, the same Isabella who funded Columbus' extremely questionable adventure, was said to have bathed twice in her entire lifetime. 2 times, not 2 per week, not 2 per month, 2 lifetime baths. Even medieval chroniclers found this concerning, which says a lot, because medieval chroniclers thought bathing annually was downright indulgent. To compensate, Isabella used layers of linen underclothes to absorb, well, everything. These were changed often, so technically she stayed as clean as a person could be under the circumstances. But still, 2 baths is a commitment to hygiene minimalism that borders on philosophical. Now, let's drift into England, where royalty had some of the most endearing and bewildering hygiene habits. Queen Elizabeth I, for example, loved white lead makeup. It gave her a pale, regal glow. It also slowly poisoned her. She washed her face with mercury-infused concoctions, applied toxic cosmetics, and powdered everything until she resembled a very determined ghost. Her teeth also suffered from the national English hobby of eating sugar like it was a personality trait. Foreign ambassadors politely noted that the Queen's smile was blackened, which is ambassador speak for "please don't make me stand too close." Elizabeth herself joked about it, which is honestly impressive. Imagine ruling an empire while fully aware that your teeth are crumbling like medieval chalk. Now drift gently with me to Scandinavia again. The Vikings, interestingly, bathed weekly far more than medieval Christians. They even had bathhouses and combs. This shocked English monks, who accused Vikings of stealing local women by being too clean, which is maybe the most uniquely medieval complaint ever recorded. But as Viking culture blended with medieval Christian kingdoms, bathing frequency slid right downhill. By the 1300s, even Scandinavian nobles were avoiding baths with the same enthusiasm they previously avoided losing battles. Perfume took over, powder took over. Soap, when it existed, was mostly used to wash clothes, not bodies. Let's drift now into the German lands. Emperor Frederick II, who was brilliant, scientific, and occasionally exasperating, actually believed in washing. He recommended regular baths, fresh air, and proper grooming, which made him an outlier, almost suspiciously clean by medieval standards. Chroniclers praised him for smelling pleasant, which is one of those backhanded compliments you Give unless every other ruler you've met smelled like a damp tapestry. But Frederick was surrounded by nobles who weren't exactly following his example. Visitors to court complained of overwhelming perfume-heavy incense, layers of unwashed fabrics, and rooms with the airflow of a storage closet. Imagine wearing wool, velvet, brocade, leather, and metal all at once, while standing near people who bathe seasonally, and yet somehow everyone acted normal. Let's drift into a quieter corner now. Medieval royal beauty standards. Being beautiful often meant being pale, being plump, being soft, and avoiding the sun like it owed you money. This meant nobles rarely went outside. Their skin had never met vitamin D. Their bodies softened into what chroniclers called courtly elegance, which is medieval for you. Look nice, and also like you might faint if someone sneezes near you. Peasants, meanwhile, were sunburned, muscled, and sturdy. Royal beauty standards didn't match reality, they just matched symbolism. So kings and queens powdered their faces, oiled their hair, tinted their cheeks, and wore fragrances heavy enough to stun a horse. The result? A court where everyone looked porcelain, moved slowly, and smelled like a mix of roses, spices, and linen that needed several afternoons to air out. Softly now, let's float to a more humorous detail. Royal dentistry, or rather, the lack of it. Sugar was expensive, so only the wealthy could afford it. This means nobles had worse teeth than peasants. A lot worse. Henry III of France collected sweet candies like rare gems. Anne of Brittany ground her teeth at night so aggressively that her dentists gave up. Noble children had blackened teeth by adolescence. Adults lost molars early. Royal smiles were complicated, and because dentistry was in the experimental phase, most treatments involved either pulling everything or praying, sometimes both. But perhaps the sleepiest, softest truth about medieval hygiene is this one. No one noticed. Not really. People were used to smells, used to sweat, used to wool and smoke and incense and animals and damp stone walls. The royal courts we imagine as glittering halls of elegance were really more like warm, crowded rooms full of perfumes and velvet, and humans who occasionally remembered to wash. But among all of this, somehow the sense of royalty remained. The crowns still sparkled, the silks still shimmered, and the nobles still carried themselves like people above ordinary life, even as they avoided baths like a deadly plague. Welcome back. If you're still floating with me, still breathing slowly, still sinking just a little deeper into that warm, heavy calm, then part 7 will settle over you like a soft blanket. Tonight, we're redrifting into medieval fashion and medicine to forces that shaped royal lives more than politics ever could. One made them look magnificent, the other made them suffer magnificently. Don't worry though, we'll keep everything gentle, slow, and pleasantly drowsy. Let's wander in. We'll start with medieval fashion, because nothing says sleepy historical irony like clothing so elaborate it could injure you. Royal clothing wasn't designed for comfort. It wasn't even designed for mobility. It existed purely to announce, hello, I'm important. Also, please help me stand up. Noble gowns were layered like geological formations. You started with a linen chemise, then a long wool kirtle, then an overgown of velvet, then brocade sleeves, then furs, then a belt that felt like it weighed as much as a toddler. And that was just the women. Men wore padded doublets that restricted movement enough to cause mild existential reflection. Some kings couldn't bend at the waist without help, which must have made dropping anything onto the floor a minor political crisis. One chronicler wrote that Charles V of France dressed in 3 layers of fabric at all times, regardless of the season, which explains why he fainted with suspicious frequency. Fashion wasn't an outfit. It was a slow, wearable medical condition. Let's drift lightly into the world of royal shoes. You might imagine something practical, stable, supportive, but no. European nobles invented pull-in shoes with long, floppy, pointed toes. Some were so long that they had to be tied to the wearer's knees with little chains, like a medieval version of ankle monitors. King Henry IV of England once banned excessively long pull-ins because men kept tripping in them during important ceremonies. Nothing says authority like a room full of nobles, collapsing like decorative dominoes. Now, let's drift softly into headwear. Royal headgear was ambitious. Women wore hennins, those tall, conical hats that looked like early architectural experiments. Some were over 2 feet long. A sudden breeze could turn them into accidental wind instruments. The court of Burgundy adored them. The court of France mocked them. The court of England tolerated them, because English fashion has always responded to French trends with the emotional range of a tired sigh. But the real problem, these hats bruised foreheads, caused headaches, and required hair to be plucked to achieve the fashionable high hairline. A perfectly rounded noble forehead often meant a lifetime of tweezing. Beauty, apparently, required both pain and commitment. Now, gently, let's shift from fashion to medieval medical treatments. This is where things get truly soothing, and that's slow. I can't believe they survived this sort of way. Royal physicians meant well. They were educated. They had theories. Unfortunately, all those theories were wrong. Their favorite treatment was bloodletting, which they applied with the enthusiasm of a modern fitness influencer offering juice cleanses. Feeling faint, bloodletting. Feeling bloated, bloodletting. Feeling fine, definitely bloodletting, just to keep you humble. King Charles II of England, the Restoration King, was bled so heavily during his final illness that the process probably killed him faster than the disease. He received 6 bodily bleedings, 1 neck bleeding, an emetic, multiple enemas, a strong purgative, powdered pearls, bezoar stone, and a drink made from pulverized human skull, all within 24 hours. If you're wondering how he survived that long, he didn't. Let's float now to leeches. Leeches were the medieval doctor's best friend. They were natural, reusable, and easy to store, basically the medieval version of a home medical kit. Royal children often had leeches applied behind their ears for fevers. Louis XIII of France had so many leech treatments as a child that his physicians kept a special jar of them in his nursery. Imagine being a royal toddler, barely able to speak, and your daily routine includes blood-sucking worms. It builds character. Apparently, another favorite remedy, urine analysis. Physicians carried around glass flasks and inspected royal pee with great intensity. They swirled it, held it to the light, smelled it, compared its color to charts. Half their diagnoses were basically, well, it's yellow. Let's bleed you again. But perhaps the funniest and sleepiest medical trend was balancing the humors. The humors were 4 bodily fluids believed to control everything about you. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile if you were depressed. Too much black bile if you had a fever. Too much blood if you were a medieval king with anxiety, political stress, and poor sleep. Well, still too much blood. No matter what happened, too much blood. The solution was always identical. Remove blood, apply herbs, avoid bathing, and eat bland food. Naturally, they made it worse. Let's drift next into royal diets, because half of their medical issues came from what they refused to eat. Vegetables were considered peasant food, so nobles lived on bread, wine, salted meat, more bread, cheese, pastries, and the occasional sad pear. There were entire months where kings didn't eat a single fresh green thing. King John of England once went for months consuming only bread, wine, and roast goose. He felt terrible. His physicians blamed the stars. We can also drift gently into cosmetics as medical treatment. Many nobles believed makeup cured skin issues. It did not. Queen Elizabeth I's beloved white lead foundation smoothed her skin, while slowly poisoning her. Catherine de' Medici used perfumed gloves soaked in chemicals to protect her hands. This caused rashes, which she treated with more perfumed gloves. A perfect, endless loop. But there was one medical practice that actually worked: baths in hot springs. Mineral baths genuinely relieved joint pain, skin issues, and stress. Kings like Henry IV of France visited them yearly, calling the baths healing, which they were, but physicians insisted on adding herbs, oils, and occasionally wine to the water for balance, because medieval doctors couldn't just let something work without adding a little unnecessary flair. And as we drift toward the end of this part, we arrive softly at a simple, sleepy truth. Medieval royal life was glamorous in appearance and medically questionable behind the scenes. They dressed like angels. They smelled like incense and wool. They followed treatments that would terrify a modern doctor. And they walked around carrying the combined weight of 5 layers of velvet, a metal belt, a jeweled crown, and the constant fear of baths. It was a strange, soft, slightly tragic world, perfect for drifting off to sleep. Hey everyone, if you're still awake at this point, congratulations. If not, well, your subconscious will enjoy some medieval nutrition trivia while you dream of slightly stale barley loaves. So, let's drift back into things. We're slowly wandering now into one of the oddest intersections in medieval daily life. The moment when bread politics and royal incompetence all converged into one large, slightly moldy loaf. And yes, it happened more often than you'd think. You see, bread wasn't just bread. It was economy. It was politics, it was status, and, rather unfortunately, it was also the medieval equivalent of a public health crisis waiting patiently to happen. Tonight, we're resettling into a few more stories of how something as simple as grain could shape the lives of kings, peasants, and the extremely confused people in between. So, get comfortable. Let's float gently forward. The medieval grain panic cycle. One comforting thing about the Middle Ages is that their problems were predictable. Every few years went something like this: a grain shortage, a slow realization that taxes had been set ridiculously high, a royal official insisting everything was perfectly fine, and then, naturally, riots, because of course, medieval rulers loved to pretend they understood agriculture. Most didn't, at all. Picture a king who had never planted anything in his life, summoning advisors to discuss the state of the winter wheat yield. This is the sort of audience where everyone nods solemnly while thinking, he definitely thinks wheat grows in barrels. This misunderstanding created a loop that modern nutrition influencers would absolutely adore, a panic-driven obsession with bread quality, and ironically, this insecurity about bread quality led to some genuinely superior products, but also to some royal meltdowns. Obviously, let's drift into one of those meltdowns now, when Charles the Bald was angry. About bread, Charles the Bald, who, as we've noted earlier, was not bald, was a Carolingian king who regularly demonstrated the emotional stability of a startled goose. One year, after a bad harvest, he decided that bakers were secretly conspiring to destroy the kingdom by baking bread that was too airy. This was, apparently, a national threat. He ordered inspections. Each loaf was weighed, measured, and poked by officials who almost certainly had no idea what they were doing. Imagine the sheer energy required to show up at a bakery and observe, with a serious straight face, this looks like suspiciously light rye. It didn't fix anything, naturally, but it did turn Charles' fear of underweight bread into a small historic footnote, one that modern bakers would probably laugh at, while kneading dough with slightly more professionalism than any royal official ever managed. The surprising problem of too good bread. You might think medieval people would be thrilled when bread was high quality. They were not. People were deeply suspicious of anything that seemed to fancy, especially if it was made inexplicably well. Medieval logic went something like, this bread is too soft, too white, too lovely, definitely witchcraft. In one case, a baker in the Rhineland produced unusually well-baked loaves, fine texture, clean crust, appealing smell, essentially your modern artisan sourdough. The townsfolk accused him of being in league with a demon, not a metaphorical demon, an actual infernal collaborator, you know, as one does when confronted with competent craftsmanship. The baker defended himself by explaining that he used better sieves and a cleaner oven, which ironically just made the townsfolk more suspicious. In their minds, anyone who voluntarily cleaned an oven was already halfway to the devil. It's a reminder that medieval standards for normal human behavior were wonderfully low. Bread as a quiet social minefield. Bread wasn't just a staple, it was a hierarchy. Nobles ate manchet white, soft, and made from the most pampered flour imaginable. Merchants ate a mid-tier loaf with mixed flour, Peasants ate something that resembled a lightly compressed gravel heap, and everyone knew this. One of the stranger quirks of medieval etiquette was that you could insult someone simply by handing them the wrong bread, not the wrong food, the wrong bread tier. Picture a dinner where someone offers a nobleman a dark, coarse loaf. This was basically the medieval equivalent of saying, your social rank is imaginary, and so is your haircut. Small missteps like this often launched quiet feuds, nothing dramatic. Of course, just long, tense silences and passive-aggressive bread placement at future gatherings. The true medieval battleground was the dinner table, not the battlefield. The trenches that were definitely not plates. One of the more adorable misunderstandings about medieval dining is the use of trenches, flat pieces of stale bread used as plates. These were not delightful edible plates in a magical eco-friendly kingdom. They were hardened slabs of yeasted wood. Some were so tough that archaeologists joke they could easily survive the end of the world, or at least an English winter. You were not expected to eat your trencher unless you were extremely hungry, extremely poor, or frankly too polite to refuse. Nobles preferred not to chew on something with the structural integrity of a roofing tile. Instead, after the meal, the trenchers were given to the poor, who, this is grimly impressive, did eat them. Imagine being at the very bottom of society and thinking, ah yes, time to enjoy this delicious former plate. Yet, nutritionally, these plate breads were sometimes healthier than what modern people snack on between meetings. So there's that. Royal attempts at bread reform. All failed monarchs repeatedly attempted to fix the bread market. The way modern politicians attempt to fix things they only vaguely understand. Most of these attempts were poorly planned, economically useless, burdensome to bakers, and occasionally hilarious. One French king tried to enforce a rule that all bread must contain a specific ratio of wheat to barley. The problem, he picked a ratio not actually possible to achieve without producing a loaf that had the texture of a densely woven bath towel. Another monarch insisted that bakers must sell bread at the same price year-round, regardless of harvest conditions. This led to exactly what you expect. Bakers quietly shrank the loaves until customers were buying something closer to a stale dinner roll that had lost a fight with gravity. Officials would weigh suspiciously lightweight loaves and fine bakers for bread fraud. A wonderfully dramatic term for something that was really just bakers trying not to starve. It never improved anything, but it did create some impressively bureaucratic paperwork. Henry II and the invisible bread crisis. Let's drift over to England now, where the ever-serious Henry II, he of the famously chaotic family, once lectured his advisors about the invisible hunger sweeping the countryside. This might sound philosophical. It wasn't. He had simply misinterpreted a report about grain shipments being delayed. Picture an advisor trying to gently explain that the hunger was not invisible, simply not currently happening, and Henry responding with a somber nod as if he were contemplating the very concept of hunger as a human condition. He introduced emergency measures anyway. They weren't needed, but he felt better. It was one of history's earliest examples of a leader solving a problem that didn't exist and accidentally creating a minor logistical disaster in the process. A comforting tradition that continues to this day. The strange case of the bread deserts. Modern nutritionists talk about food deserts. The Middle Ages, naturally, had a medieval version. Certain towns, especially in colder regions, would sometimes run out of bread entirely because their mills froze or their grain shipments were delayed. People would travel miles to buy a single loaf. This created the phenomenon known as bread routes, where bakers knew they could sell at absurd prices. Essentially, medieval pop-up shops, except instead of bubble tea, it was overpriced dry loaf with a texture resembling sandpaper dipped in nostalgia. Peasants hated this, of course, but they had no choice. In a few records, villagers describe spending half a day traveling to find bread, only to return home with something that was already stale. It was the medieval version of buying groceries and realizing halfway home that you forgot the one thing you actually came for, but with more frostbite. Why medieval bread didn't make people sick. Yet one comforting truth, medieval bread, despite its terrifying ingredients, rarely made people ill. Because the flour was so unprocessed, it retained more fiber, more micronutrients, fewer chemical contaminants, and, unintentionally, more protein from random bits that fell in during grinding. You can interpret that last point however you like. Medieval people did not ask questions. It was probably for the best. But, slowly, as we drift toward the later Middle Ages, bread quality changes, and not in a good way. Mills industrialize a bit. Sifting becomes more refined. People begin craving whiter and whiter flour essentially. Medieval health washing, where pale bread was seen as pure, elite, superior. This shift leads to nutritional deficiencies. Sigh. Humans will always decide that something slightly impractical is a status symbol, and then stick with it, no matter how much it hurts them. A quiet return to the royals will end part 8 by gently drifting back to the royal households because wherever food mattered, royalty inevitably managed to make something unnecessarily complicated. Royal kitchens were enormous, chaotic, noisy places. Yet, in the soft candlelit corners, there were always stacks of bread, usually the best in the kingdom. Soft manchet for the court, fine wholemeal for the stable hierarchy, coarse loaf for servants, and trenchers for the table. And yet, despite having the best bread available, so many royals complained constantly about it. Richard II once insisted his loaves were too crusted. Eleanor of Aquitaine demanded her chefs produce bread with less air, more body, which sounds suspiciously like ordering an aggressively dense pillow. King John was furious when his manchet loaves were made with slightly under-sifted flour, declaring it an insult. Yes, an actual insult. From flour. These were people who believed themselves chosen by God, yet were emotionally wounded by a mildly imperfect loaf. A reminder that royal dignity was always more fragile than their crowns suggested.